And it's important to realize that Emma Smith, at the founding of LDS, the LDS Church, she was the elect lady. She was one of the three top leaders of the LDS Church. Joseph, Oliver, and Emma were the three top leaders. And at that time, for her to be ordained as the elect lady over the church, and especially over women, no other woman that I can find had that kind of authority in early America.
Hi, guys. So I wanted to give a quick disclaimer before this episode because I have been having some serious internet problems. I don't know what's going on, but my last couple episodes, the software is like kicking me out. On this one, I have to use like the raw footage and it's really blurry on my side. Thankfully, Maxine's recording came through really nicely. So I apologize for the low quality video. The information is really good. This was a really good conversation, and I'm so grateful that I got to do this with her. The intent of this episode is to try and help understand people that are struggling within the church with women's place in the organization, in the functioning of things. I personally don't have a problem, and so I just want to understand better where people are coming from. I think it's fascinating, the information that Maxine has been studying throughout her entire life. And I think it's valuable information to know and understand. And I also think it's really interesting that just days after I recorded this, an article, which I will link in the caption below, came out in the Deseret News about a woman in the New Testament that was hiding in plain sight. The elect lady is what she is called. Yeah, the title is Stunning Find, Meet the Missing Woman in the Bible Rediscovered by a BYU Researcher. In Maxine's episode, she talks about how women have been removed from the Bible and how the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the original days, Emma was actually the elect lady, which I find fascinating how much that matches with the New Testament, and it was just now discovered. So obviously that was inspiration by Joseph Smith. I know women have issue with the restructuring of how things originally were with Joseph Smith to what it's like now. But the words that just continually come to mind is when I think about that is Mosiah 3:19, where it says that we should become as a child, submissive, meek, humble, patient, full of love, willing to submit to all things which the Lord seeth fit to inflict upon him, even as a child doth submit to his father. There is real value in submitting yourself and humbling yourself to the Lord and to God's will. Something this important and significant is not necessarily a mistake. In my opinion, I believe that God has a reason for things playing out the way that they have in many instances. And if I could sit down with you and get personal and tell you some of the miracles that I've seen in my life in the last month, it's undeniable how God is so involved in our lives. And for something at this scale, the way that the church is run is intentional. There is a reason for everything, and you may not understand that reason, but you just need to trust God. Today, I wanted to talk to Maxine about feminism in the church. A couple episodes ago, we talked about the Family Proclamation with Amber Dawn Pierce, and there was something said that really upset a lot of people, and I wasn't so aware of this. And I've been wanting to talk to you, Maxine, anyways, but because of this kind of domino effect of what's happened from that episode, I thought it would be a good time to talk to you now. And thankfully, you've agreed to chat with me about this. So, Maxine, you have an incredible story. Like, it's incredible what you've been through. And I want to talk about it just a little bit, but I'll link your comeback episode for people who really want your in-depth like comeback story. Your knowledge and your opinion and your perspective is just invaluable. And so I'm just really honored and grateful that you're here. And I can't wait to learn from you and to just kind of hopefully give everybody a more fresh perspective on things we don't understand, whether we're more on the feminist side or don't understand so much where they're coming from. Hopefully, that doesn't put too much pressure on you.
No,
Would you mind giving just a brief bio, like whatever you want the audience to know?
sure. And thanks for inviting me on your show. I've always really liked my association with you when I was on the Comeback podcast. That was fun to get to know you. So I'm excited for your own podcast here. But for me, I'm basically a historian and theologian. I studied history and I studied theology and other things as well, but those are my two main focus areas. I basically was co-teaching up at the U of U in gender studies. I did my bachelor's in gender studies up at the University of Utah, and then I did graduate work in chaplaincy and theology and was at Harvard, was a fellow out there. And then I also did graduate work in history. I find that in order to understand the situation of Mormon women in history and in the church, it has really helped me to combine the training and the lenses of history, studying history, and also theology and also ministry. By combining those three lenses, it's given me a depth and a breadth of understanding of women's status in LDS tradition that I think you don't get if you just study one area, if you only study history or you only study theology. And history and theology are so connected, they're so intertwined in LDS history that I think it takes a real understanding of religion and ministry and theology and history to really get what was going on there for women. So I have a unique understanding of Mormon women's history and or LDS women's history and theology and their authority. And so I have focused a lot in my work on LDS women's authority. I've studied Utah history and written about that, and I've studied LDS history and women's history and the LDS tradition, and I've written about that. So basically, what I do is research and write on gender in religion. I've also spent years, about 15 years, studying early Christian history and Christian liturgy, particularly the Christian year, the holy year with the holy days and seasons. And I spent years really studying that and discovering the role of the divine feminine in that. Because what happened was in all of my work, my feminist work on recovering women's history and theology and authority and priesthood in Mormon tradition or LDS tradition, I keep saying Mormon, LDS tradition, when I was recovering that, I spent years doing that, and then I published my first book called Women and Authority, Reemerging Mormon Feminism to show that women's priesthood, blessings, mother in heaven, all the aspects of female or feminist theology were there in LDS origins at the beginning. And it's way better than we think. It's way better than what we've realized because we lost so much of what we had over time and we have forgotten what we had. And so there's this need to bring back and recover what LDS women had in terms of their ecclesiastical authority and equality, their rights and abilities to give blessings, their connection to the Divine Mother, their equality in LDS theology and ecclesiastical structure. It's there. And many of us have worked to recover that. I was not the first or nor the only one. The long line of women historians and theologians and scholars who've worked on this for 50 years. And so we've all worked really hard. And I feel like each decade we've made some progress. And especially the last 10 to 15 years, there's been more progress than I've seen over the course of my life. So things are improving in terms of recovering women's equality, what we lost, what's forgotten, and yet it's right there in our origins. So anyway, when I published my book, it came out in 1992, and it kind of, really went after everything. It hit the whole topic. We talked about Mother in Heaven. We talked about feminism, Mormon feminism, that it's there from the beginning. We have our own feminism that's inherent in our tradition. It didn't come, we didn't adopt it from the secular feminists. We had our own. And then we talked about women's priesthood, what they had, the access to priesthood that they had So we kind of hit all three in that book, and it was too soon. It was too much too soon. The leaders, they just weren't ready for a landslide of feminist theology in 1992. It was kind of too much. And back then, it was okay to talk about this stuff in private conferences and papers, but it wasn't okay to talk about it in public. And so all of us got in trouble. The September 6th, who were disciplined, excommunicated in 1993, were all in my book except for one, Abraham Gileadi. But they were all in my book in one way or another. So we all got in trouble. But honestly, I have to say, because I've always been a mystic and a very spiritual person and very close to God over the course of my life, except for my own years, like you, when I kind of had questions and went through an atheist phase in my life. For the rest of the part, I've always been really close to God. And going through working on my book and going through the excommunication, I was very close to God through all of that. And I was spiritually led and guided by higher wisdom and higher beings who came to me and helped me and came to me in dreams. And the others who were excommunicated had the same experience. They experienced divine guidance through dreams and spiritual experiences during that whole time. So I think it was meant to, I mean, I really got the strong spiritual message that it was foreordained, it was meant to be, because the things that we were working on were so important. We were all doing recovery work and healing work for LDS tradition. And it was so important that it had to be controversial. It had to hit the media. It had to go bigger than it would have gone, because that way more people, thousands and millions of people knew about our work instead of just a handful or a few or a small number of people in Utah. So it blew our work up huge on the national scene. And so, because of that, my book, our work really became much more known, and it has this staying power. It kind of gave our work eternal life. My book is still in demand. People are still buying it 33 years later. I mean, no, most books don't have a life like that. So, I really felt it was meant to be. But and it was an extraordinary experience. It was quite a spiritual experience to go through that. And then I was spiritually guided and led on my path of where to go next and what to do. And so that's why I went to early Christianity and began studying early Christianity and the Christian year. I began ministerial training and liturgical training to understand the sacraments, the Mass, communion, how to do all of that, and studying the Christian year and all the holy days. So what I had done in LDS religion by recovering female priesthood and the female side of the LDS tradition and the mother in heaven, this kind of repressed female side that was there all along from the beginning, from the very first vision, when wisdom, the divine wisdom, our mother, guides Joseph to the sacred grove, an Asherah grove, and brings him to God. That's the role of the mother in the apocryphal scriptures that were in his Bible, the Smith family Bible that Joseph was reading as a child. It's the wisdom literature is all right there. And it says wisdom is, she's been with God from the beginning, and she maketh us friends of God. She maketh men friends of God and prophets. And it also says, I learned to seek her early in my youth. So Joseph Smith grows up reading all this wisdom literature in the family Bible, right? And then he credits wisdom as the catalyst for his first vision, which is really interesting. So she's there from the beginning. When I left Mormonism due to excommunication and really wanted to find a spiritual path that was profound, I went to Gnostic Christianity, early Christianity. And so I wound up doing the same thing again. So what I discovered was that when I went into early Christianity and liturgical studies and ministry in the Christian sacramental tradition, I discovered the very same problem that I had discovered in LDS church and tradition, which was the female side had been repressed. And so I spent, those years when I was out of the church as an excommunicated member, focused on Christian liturgy. And I discovered that the Christian year was entirely focused on the work and the life and the story of Jesus from Advent to Pentecost. But there was this mystery on the other side of the year where the major female holy days were, which reflected the journey and the story of Mary, his mother, who also is a embodiment of the Sophia. And her holy days and her journey, her birth, her ascension is all parallel to Jesus, and it's on the other side of the year. So I spent those years recovering that feminist theology in Christian tradition, which was really fun. I loved it. And so I discovered that I had to do the same thing all over again because religion, for some reason, tends to begin with the feminine and then repress it. So anyway, so I did all that work on Christian liturgy and recovering the female side of the Christian year and her holy days. And then I got the spiritual call to come back to the LDS church, which really surprised me. I didn't think I would be coming back, but it was utterly real and guided by divine inspiration and wisdom and dreams. And when I came back to the church in 2011 and 2012, I experienced such an amazing opening of spiritual gifts and knowledge pouring down unto me, in spite of the fact that I'd been excommunicated, and in spite of the ways that the church still subverts women's authority and equality. But I came back with a whole new understanding of women's status in LDS tradition. So I came back guided by God and inspiration and trusting that I needed to come back. And I didn't know all the reasons why. I wasn't sure of what I was doing, but I trusted God. I trusted that I got a definite call and guidance to come back. And so I followed that. And when I did, all of these other understandings and wisdom and spiritual gifts and doors opening came after my faith, after I exhibited my faith in God to just simply return. Then the evidence and the proof of why I was called to come back unfolded. And so we can talk about that more. I know you have questions about that, but that's kind of the story basically, is that I was excommunicated, but it really felt like a very spiritual experience. And I was led and guided during the years out of the church to discover deeper aspects of female theology. And then I was led back when it was the right time. And so for me, it's been a really beautiful journey. I love the journey and I don't regret any part of it. I love it all and it's made me who I am.
I have so many questions, so I'll pick and choose. First off, so I was re-listening to your comeback episode today. I didn't get to finish it, but I got about halfway through. And you did mention that throughout your journey outside of the church and going to, I think it was Gnosticism is what you said you were drawn to, because besides the LDS church, it is the closest to the early Christianity time frame theology. So
Yeah.
you were saying that, but you also said, and maybe I misinterpreted this, but as far as like feminism goes and the repression of women, it seemed to me like throughout all the churches, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was more empowering to women than any other church that you found.
Yeah, what I was saying was that the LDS tradition had more types and levels of female authority and ministry and priesthood than I found in other traditions. It's not fully expressed, it's not fully recovered and integrated and named and operationalized. But because I'm a historian and I know, and a theologian, and I know what's there in LDS theology and history, I could see that the way the church was originally conceived and set up, women had far more authority and access to ministry and priesthood than what I saw in other churches. It was a paradoxical thing because I could see that in LDS tradition it was there, but I could also see that it still hadn't been recovered yet. But because of that potential that the LDS women had a very democratic lay ministry and authority there, and because they had a female order of priesthood, which was the Relief Society. It was a female order of priesthood, which we haven't fully understood, but they understood it, and it's very clear in the Relief Society minutes. And then they also had an inclusive order of priesthood with men in the temple. And I thought, wow, LDS women have ministry and priesthood on three levels, whereas in other churches I was seeing sort of one level or one type. And it's important to realize that Emma Smith, at the founding of LDS, the LDS Church, she was the elect lady. She was one of the three top leaders of the LDS Church. Joseph, Oliver, and Emma were the three top leaders. They had the highest authority of anyone in the church, and they were a kind of a trinity or presidency. I call them the proto first presidency. They were a lay Christian presidency, but instead of Peter, James, and John, it was Joseph, Oliver, and Emma. And at that time, for her to be ordained as the elect lady over the church, and especially over women, no other woman that I can find had that kind of authority in early America. We have Anne Hutchinson, who was preaching in the 1600s and tossed out of the, Massachusetts Bay Colony for it. And we have women who were called and given official roles as ministers or preachers. But we don't see a woman ordained, formally ordained to high church or highest church office, co-leading an entire church with the vote and approval of the church, like we see with Emma. So what we have is better than we realize, but the church hasn't even fully realized it yet. We're still recovering it.
And that brings me to another question that came to mind when you were talking is what changed? Was it the death of Joseph, or did Emma get, I guess, not replaced, but like, did that get restructured before Joseph was martyred? Like, when did that change? Do we know why that changed?
It takes deep historical work to know what happened, and it's still work that is coming forward, and it's still hard for a lot of historians to see it, but it happened during the succession crisis, which is why it's hard to see. It happened after Joseph died because Emma and Brigham clashed and did not get along. And Brigham did not have the same egalitarian view of women and their equality with men in the church that Joseph had. So while Joseph authorized and implemented women's equality at all three levels, the lay ministry in 1830 with the first and second elder and the elect lady, section 24 and 25, and then he established their equality between the Relief Society and the Melchizedek priesthood. And the Relief Society presidency and the first presidency, which was actually the first presidency over the high priesthood. It was the first presidency over the Melchizedek priesthood. And Emma and the Relief Society presidency were the presidency over the female priesthood, which was parallel. And then in the temple, Joseph gave men and women exactly the same endowment with the same robes, the same ordinances, and they each got the fullness of the priesthood and its keys. So women had parallel equality on all three levels. All three levels changed for a number of reasons.
Okay, wait, sorry. When you keep saying all three levels, can you define what you mean when you say all three levels?
Yeah, sure. By the three levels, imagine a birthday cake with three layers. I love this metaphor. And the first layer is the lay ministry in 1830. It's the church, it's sacrament meeting, it's how we all get to go to the pulpit and preach, and we all get to be missionaries. It's the lay Christian ministry that the church was modeled on in 1830 because Joseph wasn't developing ancient priesthoods yet, not until 1831 and afterwards. So that first layer of the layer cake or LDS tradition is just lay Christian ministry. So the offices in the D&C, section 20, 24, and 25 are early Christian New Testament offices. He's not really exploring Melchizedek priesthood yet, not offices or the order yet. So the lay Christian ministry is very much the New Testament. It's the restoration of the Jesus movement, Jesus and his disciples and his apostles. So that's the lay Christian ministry level, and that's the first layer on the cake. The second layer of the cake is ancient female and male priesthood, gendered priesthoods, their own orders. So that's Melchizedek priesthood and Relief Society. And that starts to emerge after 1831 for both. We tend to think of the Relief Society as only happening in 1840, but the 1842 Relief Society restored and formalized what the women were already doing in 1833 to 36 when they were working on the Kirtland Temple. That was when the Sisters, Society of Sisters, working on the temple began. And so they simply repeated the same thing in Nauvoo, but then it was formalized as an official ecclesiastical body of priesthood parallel to the male priesthood. So that's the second layer on the cake is Melchizedek priesthood and Relief Society priesthood. The third layer on the cake is the temple priesthood, which is a different priesthood. It's where the Melchizedek priesthood and the Relief Society priesthood were brought together into a new inclusive order, the holy order of the temple, of God, of Christ. It's the holy order. And so that's the top layer of the three layers.
Okay. So you've got the church, the priesthood, the temple, to put it simply.
Yeah, you've got kind of
Okay.
the lay ministers of the church from age 8 when you're baptized and you're confirmed, you're a lay minister of the church and you get to preach. You get to go up to the pulpit and preach in sacrament meeting. You know, kids who've been baptized at 8 come up and preach on fast and testimony meeting. And that pulpit is where a priest would normally stand in another, or a minister would stand in another tradition. But we have a democratic lay ministry that restores that early Christian movement of disciples.
Let's go back to the original question of like how did this get lost? Because I was talking to my friends, we were talking about
Yeah.
how women used to be able to give blessings of healing. And I guess one of the women who was really well known for this was a daughter of Brigham Young.
Mhm.
And she had recorded like over 1,000 blessings of healing that she gave in the temple. And so I'm just wondering, why was it stopped? Do we know the timeline?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, it's really interesting that women giving blessings continued past the succession crisis when Brigham rose to lead the church. That's one of the things that continued. The Relief Society didn't. It stopped meeting due to all the crisis. Nauvoo was a war zone. So there were a number of things going on, and LDS members were afraid they were going to be killed. So they had to leave Nauvoo under duress. And there was all of this competition about who was supposed to lead the church and disagreement over that, including Emma and Lucy did not agree with Brigham as the new leader, and others didn't. And so the church was fracturing. So during the succession crisis, I see both sides. I don't condemn Brigham Young as taking over and that what he did was, not right. I think that he had to do what he did to manage the church and get it out of Nauvoo and across the river in the winter and get it headed across the plains. I mean, this was a colossal effort. He was an amazing organizer, amazing leader, but the way that he did it was to consolidate authority under him. And I understand why he did that because of the situation, but at the same time, it subverted that equality that women had had. So women's authority on all three levels in the temple, the new temple ceremony, and in the Relief Society and in the lay ministry, women's equality got subverted under his authority and under men's authority in that shift during the succession crisis. So could he have done it differently? I don't know. Maybe. I think it could have been done better than it was, but he did what he had to do to save the church and get it out of Nauvoo. So that's what happened. So women's authority changed and it was put under men's authority and under the authority of the apostles at that time, which it was not before that. But women giving blessings continued across the plains and in Utah and in the early church. Women giving blessings and doing healings, that was one of the things that was not changed. It continued into the 20th century. Women were still doing it at the turn of the century and into the 1930s. And we even see a few scarce reports of a couple of blessings, blessing a mother before childbirth during what they called her confinement. I think the Oakley Ward blessing was from the 50s. So this practice continued. And one of the Relief Society presidents, it was in the early 20th century, she called it the Beautiful Ordinance. And Joseph Smith had called the Relief Society the Beautiful Order, which is really interesting. So the Relief Society president, I think it was Robinson, I'm pretty sure it was, she said, we need to, paraphrasing, she said, we need to respect and take great care with the beautiful ordinance and keep it private, keep it sacred and private. So it was continuing, but over time, women's authority and women's priesthood was forgotten over time. And the women's blessings were the only thing that continued. Well, that plus the Relief Society presidency still had a lot of authority. The Relief Society presidency was still in charge over all the women. They were still running their own program. They were administering their own program, coming up with their own lessons, publishing their own magazines, the Women's Exponent and the Relief Society magazine. So the Relief Society presidency's authority over all the women continued clear up until 1970, when they were brought under priesthood correlation in 1970, and the Relief Society magazine was discontinued. So their own parallel equality was subsumed under priesthood correlation. And that was kind of the last, I call it nail in the coffin, in this long trend of women losing their parallel equality over time. So women's blessings, you can read about that in a number of places. Linda Newell wrote a wonderful, groundbreaking article in Sunstone magazine called Gifts of the Spirit, Women's Share. And she talks about women giving blessings and how they used to do it and how they lost it. And that's a Sunstone article from 1983 or 84. And others have written about it. Chris Wright and Jay Stapley have done a lot of work on women's blessings. They've published 2 articles on women's blessings that you can find, I think, in the Journal of Mormon History, and I'm trying to remember where else. I think Dialogue. Since that time, it kind of stopped. By the late 50s, by 1960, early 60s, it stopped. But then in the 1990s, women started recovering it, because when Linda Newell's article came out in the early 80s and women realized, her article really brought back that knowledge. Women started talking about it. And that's when I got involved in Mormon feminism in the 80s. Well, actually in the 70s, but I mean, in these circles of working together. And we would meet in circles, and we started giving blessings again in the 80s and early 90s, because we realized from all this scholarship that was happening at that time to recover the lost memory, that we wanted to try to, experience that and bring it back ourselves. But we kept it very private. It was in private circles. But I will say that trend of women gathering in circles to give blessings to each other has continued. And it's private. It's not done in the church. I hope it comes back. I think it will. But it's ever since about the early 60s, it's gone private.
Is that when people were starting to convene into groups and give blessings? Is this kind of when the women in the priesthood started to emerge in the church? Is this kind of what triggered it?
Yeah, it was the 1980s when articles by women scholars and historians started to come out. The book about Emma Smith, her biography, came out also in 1984. Linda Newell's articles in Sunstone and Dialogue came out in 82 to 84. And then the Exponent 2 publication, which began back in 1974, that Exponent 2 publication was also bringing this knowledge back, because they were reading the old Women's Exponent, and this information was in the Women's Exponent, the Relief Society publication, of the 19th century. So yeah, women started recovering that practice privately.
Interesting. So I want to know, what advice do you have to women who are struggling in the church right now with feeling like, it's controlled by men, and there is a there was an argument going on online about the word preside or the phrase preside over in the Family Proclamation. And so,
Mhm.
um, maybe let's just start there. The line in the Family Proclamation, it says, by divine design, fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness and are responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families. Mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. In these sacred responsibilities, fathers and mothers are obligated to help one another as equal partners. Disability, death, or other circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation. I'm just going to say, like, up front, I don't have a problem with this paragraph, but I know there are a lot of women that do. And so I kind of want to know, how do you reconcile these things coming from your background and your perspective?
Right. Well, it's interesting. The proclamation came out 2 years after I was excommunicated. So those were
Oh,
rough times. And the proclamation was written by men. It wasn't co-authored by women. The women had no part of it. So it was a very male and traditional perspective. So what I would say is looking then versus now, things have changed and progressed. So back then, men wrote it, didn't talk to the Relief Society leaders about it, and then it was presented at their meeting. Today, that wouldn't happen. Today, things have progressed to the point that the Relief Society leaders would be involved in co-authoring something like that today, I fully believe, because of the way that those women sit on the highest councils, except for the Quorum of the 12. Um, Today, it would be a collaborative effort. It would be co-authored and it would be a collaborative effort. So that has changed. Also, the rhetoric has changed. I mean, even President Oaks recently talked, he referred to how things have changed a lot in the last decade or so, and that more change is coming. More needs to be done to change. Today, the language that's always used is that fathers and mothers preside together over their families. So that language has really changed in church usage. In terms of how to encourage women in the church today with that problem of men presiding over women, which does continue in the church, even though the language has changed on parents and families to co-presiding. Men are still presiding over women in the church. But I see that changing. I see that changing. It's slow, but we're moving on all levels, on our scholarship and our recovery of history and our ministry and our wards and our meetings and our committees. We're moving on all levels toward more of a together men and women presiding and discussing things in councils and coming up with, decisions together. We still have a long way to go. I would encourage women to step into their ministry, step into the fullness of their callings, step into the fullness of their connection to God, and always pray to God for help and inspiration about how to model your spiritual empowerment. Because the more that we as women step into the authority and the offices and the callings that we do have, and the more that we model for other women and for the men we work with how to co-preside, the more it will happen. Function as that equal partner co-presiding in your callings and in the ward. And the more we do that, the more it will move us in that direction. But I really see leaders and scholars and historians and members kind of doing this all at the same time. We're all working on it. We're not there yet. But the vision that the church was founded on is that men and women preside together with equal authority, parallel equal authority. And I think we're moving back to that. I think we're recovering it, but it's slow. And in the meantime, if you've got a really patriarchal bishop or really patriarchal stake president, just pray for help, pray for guidance for how to deal with that, and continue to assert the authority and priesthood and the keys of your own office and calling. Every calling in the church is an office of the ministry and an office of priesthood, according to President Oaks, his 2014 talk. in conference or at the women's meeting, I guess. So just continue to move into that. Trust it, move into it, and you'll be guided by the Spirit and by our Father and Mother in heaven how to do that.
In my mind, I fully believe that things happen the way that God intends them to be. And like you said, that, Brigham Young reorganized things a certain way to accomplish certain things.
Yeah.
And so maybe God has intended things to end up a different way than they are right now. Like, it's my opinion that the way things are right now are the way they have been supposed to be. So my friend who I was talking to that has issues, she said it's not very welcoming to walk into a chapel and have men sitting at the front, only men. Have things like that ever bothered you? How have you reconciled things like that for yourself so that you can go to church? Because I feel like going into church and being bothered by things
Yeah.
can take away from your spiritual experience there.
Oh, yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
coming from your perspective, how can somebody, walk into a chapel and not feel unequal because they're not seeing a woman on the stand?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It hasn't bothered me very much. It bothers me a little bit. When I was chorister for my ward, it was fascinating. Right after I came back to the church, I was called as chorister, and I realized I'm on the stand with the bishopric. I'm sitting right behind them, and I'm leading the congregation in song. I'm in the role of the elect lady. I'm in the role of Emma Smith, who led the church in song, just like the prophet Miriam, who co-led the children of Israel with her brothers, Moses and Aaron. And I just felt this connection to Emma and to all the way back to Miriam, that I was leading the church, the body of Christ, in song, which is one form of our communal lay ministry worship. And that's been overlooked, that role of the chorister and how she's conducting and leading the music, which is a really important half or part of sacrament meeting. I would say it has three parts. It has the sacrament, and it has the preaching, and then it has the music. But I do think we need to get to the point where the women are on the stand, but it doesn't bother me too much because when I'm there, I tune into the spirit that is in everybody and it's working through all of us. And what I'm listening for is the spirit when I feel it and when I don't. So I notice that more than I notice who's on the stand. I notice if the speaker is just kind of giving a travelogue that doesn't inspire me, or if they're telling a story that really moves me. That's what I listen for at sacrament meeting.
My desire for this episode is to just help just come closer to God. I am not qualified to speak on anything but my own personal experience. Like I'm not a historian, I'm not a theologian, I'm not even a scriptorian. I just know I have a lot of spiritual experiences, and I have had to change so many times throughout my life because I've been through so many things. When I think about something as big and important as this, I don't think that it was ever supposed to stay that way, or it would have.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's not supposed to go back, but I believe that there is purpose in what God does. I
Yeah.
truly believe He is
Yeah.
obviously not to the point where He can take away people's agency, but things
Right.
happen for a reason.
You mentioned about trusting in God and trusting that maybe things went the way they were supposed to. And I think that's a deeply humble and insightful perspective because God gives us our agency. I don't think God controls the church. I don't think God requires the church to be as enlightened, and unconditionally loving as God is, because we're human beings. We're down here in these human bodies. God is letting human beings learn and grow, and God is guiding us. And there's always more information. There's always new revelation. This is one of the beautiful gifts of the LDS tradition is continuing revelation. It's one of the amazing things that the LDS tradition has that most other traditions don't. The way I look at it is, I don't look at it as God wanted Black members to not have priesthood, or God wanted women's equality to be suppressed or subverted. The way I look at it is, God gives us our agency, and God lets human beings learn and grow and make mistakes and do things not in the best way. And so it is all divinely guided, because where church policy and practice stands depends on where the human beings who are running it stand. And so it's all about where we're at in our spiritual progress. And God is always teaching us and showing us more. The church does progress and go the way it's kind of meant to be in terms of the collective human consciousness, where our church, our collective consciousness is at this point, because the church is going through its journey, its spiritual journey. And we're all going through our spiritual journey, and we're trying to balance our own spiritual journey with that of the church. The church has its own formation path and spiritual journey. And we have to respect both. I always say that we shouldn't let either one overwhelm the other. We should honor our own spiritual path and where it's taking us, and honor the path that the church is taking as a collective body of Christ, because it is where it's at for a reason, because that's where the collective wisdom is at any given time, and it's evolving because we have continuing revelation. And so we really need to honor both and not expect the church to be, the collective to be where we're at. I don't, and that's how I deal with it. That's how I reconcile it. I don't expect the church to be where I'm at. The church hasn't taken my journey. I remember when I met with Sherry Dew, I had a wonderful lunch with her right after I came back to the church. And she said to me, she said, I want you to write your memoir, because we need to know what you've learned. We need to know what you know, because we're not going to go where you've gone. We're not going to be excommunicated and go outside and learn all these things and come back. We need to know what you've learned. And I thought that was so profound and so wise. She's a very, very wise woman. I have so much respect for her. And that's the point. I honor my journey because I'm a very spiritual person, and I listen to God, and I do what God inspires me to do rather than what other people expect me to do. But I also honor the journeys of all my friends and fellow church members and church leaders. Each church leader is on their own journey, spiritual journey that's unfolding. It's all unfolding. We're all learning line upon line and grace upon grace, and pursuing light and more light until the perfect day. So I honor where the collective church journey is at, and I don't expect the church to be where I'm at. But I also don't let any other member shut me down or tell me what I'm supposed to do or think or believe or feel. So I honor my spiritual path, and I honor the group, and I will fight to defend both. And so it works. That's how I reconcile the different perspectives that I see in the church.
That was really good. I appreciate you sharing all of that. Anyways, I just want to thank you for giving that perspective, because that was really beautiful and insightful and wise. And it was incredible. You have been through so much. You have so much knowledge, and I just appreciate your perspective so much. And I can see why people have a difficult time from both sides of this. I can see it would feel weird. It would feel like, are we being obedient to God if we were to just like redo all of this original work, right? Like if it had been undone, there's a reason for that. So I can see the resistance of like just implementing this back into the system. And then I can also, understand having this knowledge that things were originally this way. God does view us as equals, but I've never felt that he doesn't. I've never felt that God doesn't view male and female as equals. That's never been a problem of mine. However, in the workplace, that's a different story, but that has nothing to do with religion or church or God. That is man's problem. And I have definitely felt the inequality in the workplace. I feel like what you've given us is just something to really digest and think about and pray about, and see what we can do to for one thing, magnify the callings that we have right now. Like you
Yeah.
said, just are we even, people are saying they want more, they want to be in office, they want to do this and that. It's like, are you, and maybe you are. I don't know. I know I could be doing better at everything that I've been called to do. And so it's like, are you even really fulfilling the callings and totally magnifying the callings that you have right now? When you focus on that, it makes it easier to not focus on what you don't have. And maybe I don't have a lot of problems with wanting more responsibility in the church because I have a lot on my plate right now in my life. I don't want any more than I have. I can't handle it. And I do feel that it is important for women to be raising their children. I personally feel that that is a more important role
Yeah.
than being a bishop. I think being a bishop would be so hard and being a mom is hard, but I would much rather be mothering my children.
Hmm.
And for the people who haven't had that opportunity, like Sherry Dew or Sharon Eubank, that haven't gotten married and don't have their own children,
Hmm.
they have high up callings in the church. They have a
Yeah,
lot of
they do.
responsibility. And I know that's not the case with everybody. I think what you've said is invaluable. Is there anything that you wanted to add to what you've said here about
Yeah.
any issues or just really anything?
Well, yeah, especially with what you just said, something that I think women haven't realized, and again, it's a historical, theological perspective, but women already have those offices. They have those roles. They wouldn't have to take on new roles or offices. We just haven't authorized that these are ordinations and these are offices parallel to the men's. I think all we need is a policy change to bring back those original titles and offices and their equality of authority. It's not going to make more work. Women are already doing the work. They're already leading the Relief Society and the Young Women's and the primary. And it's just a matter of formalizing their office and bringing back that knowledge that these different offices are offices of ministry or offices of priesthood, the women's priesthood, the Relief Society priesthood. So it wouldn't entail any more work. What we're doing now is women are doing all that work, but they're not fully recognized as ordained and they're not fully recognized as holding these offices and we're not fully recognized that they are parallel equality to the men's. They're not subordinate to the men's. So that's all it is, really. It's just bringing back the titles and the equality of those titles. It wouldn't add any more work. It would probably reduce stress.
Yeah, well, if that's all we need, then maybe we should just do that.
Yeah.
I do have a thought. This was something I wanted to ask you. For those women who maybe have a problem with like a female not being a bishop, because you have an elders quorum president, you have a relief society president, and then you have the bishop, and the bishopric presides over the ward. I wanted to ask, is that not modeled after early Christianity? But when I
Yeah.
think of Jesus Christ and his 12 apostles, they were all men. Are we not modeling it after that? Like, am I missing something?
That's a great question. That's a very insightful question because the church does model early Christianity and sacrament meeting does model the early house church, where there was a bishop or overseer, episcopos, and then servants. The episcopos, the overseer, the bishop was the owner of the house church. And there were women who were owners of house churches like Lydia and others. And then their servants, diakonos, were the deacons. They served the sacred meal. And then the presbyters were the preachers, the priests, who would read the sacred reading or the lesson or the letter from Paul or whoever. So it is really modeled after early Christianity, although in early Christianity, sometimes the bishops were women and sometimes the deacons were women. What I love about LDS restoration is this inclusion, the way it was originally set up, that they were parallel. And what the women would do, they actually had, the Relief Society had its own table with its tablecloth, and the young women who were deacons would bring in the water and bring in the things, the setting for the table in the Relief Society meetings. which is really interesting. It's a really interesting parallel. But I think the precedent is there for sacrament meeting to be both like it was in early Christianity, but also as it was intended to be, I think originally, that it was inclusive. The lay ministry of sacrament meeting was inclusive. Men and women both could preach. Men and women both could pray. Uh, Men and women both could vote, in the meetings to approve changes and things. As for sitting on the stand, it's kind of a both and situation. There are two dimensions here. There's one dimension of just thinking of the house church with a bishop, the servants, and the preachers, which is what we have exactly in sacrament meeting. We have the bishop and the deacon serving the sacred meal, and then we have the preacher, whoever's preaching. And in terms of the apostles, this is a really important point. Jesus did not call 12 male apostles. He called 12 male elders of Israel who represented the 12 tribes of Israel, because that's who sat on the council of synagogue, was a council of 12 elders representing the 12 tribes of Israel. That's what Jesus called. When he came to calling apostles, he called both women and men as apostles. And this was restored in Kirtland, and the early saints understood this. And the women in Kirtland saw themselves as female apostles in the restored church. And they used the term apostle. So it's interesting, but it's kind of a both and situation where Jesus was honoring his Hebrew tradition of 12 male elders in the council over a synagogue. And in his traveling synagogue with his disciples, he was doing both. He was doing two different dimensions or levels. He was honoring his Hebrew tradition of 12 elders, but he was also calling male and female disciples, which was a Greek model of the teacher, the master, and his disciples. And so Jesus is doing both. He's dealing with people who are Hebrews and also people who were not necessarily Hebrews. So he's doing both. He's transcending his tradition with this inclusive disciples who would travel with him, both men and women, but also honoring that council of 12 elders. So in the LDS restoration, you see the same thing. You see Joseph calling apostles who were elders, and it says that apostles are elders in the D&C. They were elders. But then women were also brought into that lay ministry too.
Were women actually called as apostles or just disciples in the early church?
That's a great question. In LDS origins, Joseph Smith called men as apostles, but they were elders. Their office was understood in the New Testament aspect of elders who were apostles, witnesses. So the women saw themselves as disciples, restoring the female discipleship and also the female apostleship from early Christianity. They saw themselves that way, at least according to what Edward Tulledge and Eliza R. Snow said in the book Women of Mormondom. The first chapter says that the women in Kirtland considered themselves restoring that ancient early discipleship, and they saw themselves as apostles of Christ, restoring the original Christian church. But they were not formally called as apostles to represent the church in a formal ecclesiastical or legal way to the outside world. But within the church, the private society of the church, and this is how it was in early Christianity too, women had equality inside the private space of the early Christian church, but not outside in Roman culture. And it was like that with the early LDS church. Outside, it was the men who had the authority, the official authority to represent the church. Inside the church, women were being given the right to vote. In 1830 was Section 26 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and women were co-founders of this restoration and working on the temple together and working on the church together. So in the Women in Mormondom, it says that they saw themselves as disciples and apostles of this new restoration. The women saw themselves as that. And so that was within the church itself, the sacred private sphere of the church, but not outside in its presentation to the world. So it's kind of, again, it's a duality there of On one side, it seems male and male authority, and on the other side, it's both. And so when it comes to, for example, sacrament meeting, I've wrestled with this. What's the parallel of the bishopric? Well, the Relief Society is both. It has this dual role and this dual quality. The Relief Society presidency is both. It's the parallel of the Elders Quorum presidency, but it's also the parallel of the bishopric. And you see that in the early documents. Eliza R. Snow is writing to the Relief Society in 1882 and 84 in the Women's Exponent. She's really describing the Relief Society presidencies on ward and higher levels, stake levels, as being the parallel of those leaders, the bishopric and the stake presidency. So it's really both. And there are aspects of running the ward and church welfare that the bishop handles and aspects the Relief Society president handles, you know? So they do split duties, and it would make sense to have an office for the Relief Society presidency next to the bishop's office because in some ways they are parallel and they've split the work and they're doing parallel duties. But in other ways, the Relief Society is the parallel of the Elders Quorum presidency. So what I would say is, remember I talked about the three levels, the three-layer cake. The first level is the lay ministry. That's where we see the bishop and the Relief Society functioning over the ward as managers of the ward. And that's where they're parallel. When it comes to that second layer of the cake, where we're talking about priesthood orders, Melchizedek order and Relief Society, that's where the Relief Society presidency is parallel to the Elders Quorum presidency. And so it's really both. So the Relief Society presidency could and should do both. I think they could and should sit on the stand with the bishopric. But they also function ecclesiastically in terms of a priesthood presidency over the female priesthood of the Relief Society.
But it's fascinating and it's a lot to think about, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with Oakes as the president of the church because of his background with, his mother and his father passing away at a young age, and she never remarried, and so he knows what a strong woman is, and he was raised by a strong woman. And although I know his grandparents played a part in that, but he's also he seems, at least to me, very traditional. So it'll be interesting to see like how things play out, and how God wants it to be, because what God wants to happen is going to happen. And
Yeah.
I know we've been talking for a long time and I could probably just keep asking you questions, but I will let you go. So I like to wrap up the end of each episode with an opportunity for you to give us your why. Why have you devoted so much of your life to our Savior, Jesus Christ?
Well, that's a beautiful question. And it really touches my heart because from the time I was a little girl, I felt really close to Jesus. I felt like he was my brother and he was watching over me. And I have felt close to him all my life, except for a brief period of time, a few years when I had lost faith in God in the late 80s. But because I do feel that I am his, I am a disciple of his, and I belong to him and to God. And I feel like I am here to do their work, or at least the piece of their work that they've entrusted to me. And I have devoted my life to that. It's the core of who I am, beyond scholarship and feminism and all the things I've done with my life. It's my relationship with God and with Christ that defines me and has defined my life and has guided all of my decisions. That comes first before anything else, regardless of the cost, regardless of what other people think. I do what I feel they've called me to do. And people sometimes don't understand it. Sometimes active, faithful church members don't understand it. And sometimes disillusioned members who've been disciplined or left don't understand it. But I do what I'm spiritually directed to do because of my deep love and relationship with God and with Christ. They are my home. That's my home. They are my ultimate partners in life. They guide my life.
Thank you, Maxine. That was beautiful. And I can't think of a better way to end this episode. You are You're inspiring. You do. You inspire me. I've always been so impressed by you. And what a privilege it's been to sit with you and hear your thoughts and learn from you and all the hard work you've done. And I just want to thank you for all the work you've done and for coming on here. And yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the work you've done on this podcast and also on the Comeback podcast. You were a great comfort and support to me when I did that Comeback podcast. And I'm really honored to be on your podcast. When you mentioned that you'd like to interview me, I was immediately happy to do it because of my fondness and respect for you and the role that you are playing, that you feel called to play. So thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, and share. The Be Faithful podcast is not endorsed or sponsored by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is my personal attempt to share the light of Jesus Christ and to testify that He lives. So please stay tuned for more inspiring conversations. And until next time, keep the faith.